what key moments in history of the 20th century do you think, if something else happened at those moments, we could have avoided some of the big atrocities? Stalin's Holodomor, Hitler's Holocaust, Mao's Great Chinese Famine.
The great turning point in world history is August the 2nd, 1914, when the British cabinet decides to intervene, and what would have been a European war becomes a world war. And with British intervention, it becomes a massively larger and more protracted conflict. So very early in my career, I became very preoccupied with the deliberations on that day, and the surprising decision that a Liberal cabinet took to go to war, which you might not have bet on that morning, because there seemed to be a majority of cabinet members who would be disinclined, and only a minority, including Winston Churchill, who wanted to go to war. So that's one turning point. I often wish I could get my time machine working and go back and say, wait, stop. Just think about what you're going to do. And by the way, let me show you a video of Europe in 1918. So that's one.
Can we linger on that one?
Sure.
That one, a lot of people push back on you on because it's so difficult. So the idea is, if I could try to summarize, and you're the first person that made me think about this very uncomfortable thought, which is the idea is, in World War I, it would be a better world if Britain stayed out of the war and Germany won.
Right.
Thinking now in retrospect at the whole story of the 20th century, thinking about Stalin's rule of 30 years, thinking about Hitler's rise to power and the atrocities of the Holocaust, but also, like you said, on the Eastern Front, the death of tens of millions of people through the war, and also sort of the political prisoners and the suffering connected to communism, connected to fascism, all those kinds of things. Well, that's one it's one heck of an example of why you're just like fearless in this particular style of exploring counterfactual history. So can you elaborate on that idea and maybe why this was such an important day in human history?
This argument was central to my book, The Pity of War. I also did an essay in Virtual History about this. And it's always amused me that from around that time, I began to be called a conservative historian, because it's actually a very left-wing argument. The people in 1914 who thought Britain should stay at the war were the left of the Labour Party, who split to become the Independent Labour Party. What would have happened? Well, first of all, Britain was not ready for war in 1914. There had not been conscription. The army was tiny. So Britain had failed to deter Germany. The Germans took the decision that they could risk going through Belgium, using the Schlieffen Plan to fight their two-front war. They calculated that Britain's intervention would either not happen or not matter. If Britain had been strategically committed to preventing Germany winning a war in Europe, they should have introduced conscription 10 years before, had a meaningful land army, and that would have deterred the Germans. So the Liberal government provided the worst of both worlds, a commitment that was more or less secret to intervene, that the public didn't know about, in fact, much of the Liberal Party didn't know about, but without really the means to make that intervention effective, a tiny army with just a few divisions. So it was perfectly reasonable to argue, as a number of people did on August the 2nd, 1914, that Britain should not intervene. After all, Britain had not immediately intervened against the French revolutionary armies back in the 1790s. It had played an offshore role, ultimately intervening, but not immediately intervening. If Britain had stayed out, I don't think that France would have collapsed immediately as it had in 1870. The French held up remarkably well to catastrophic casualties in the first 6 months of the First World War. But by 1916, I don't see how France could have kept going if Britain had not joined the war. And I think the war would have been over perhaps at some point in 1916. We know that Germany's aims would have been significantly limited because they would have needed to keep Britain out. If they'd succeeded in keeping Britain out, they'd have had to keep Britain out. And the way to keep Britain out was obviously not to make any annexation of Belgium, to limit German war aims, particularly to limit them to Eastern Europe. And from Britain's point of view, what was not to like? So the Russian Empire is defeated along with France. What does that really change? If the Germans are sensible, and we can see what this might have looked like, they focus on Eastern Europe. They take chunks of the Russian Empire. Perhaps they create, as they did in the Peace of Brest-Litovsk, an independent or quasi-independent Poland. In no way does that pose a threat to the British Empire. In fact, it's a good thing. Britain never had a particularly good relationship with the Russian Empire after all. The key point here is that the Germany that emerges from victory in 1916 has a kind of European Union. It's the dominant power of an enlarged Germany with a significant Mitteleuropa, whatever you want to call it, customs union type arrangement with neighboring countries, including, one suspects, Austria-Hungary. That is a very different world from the world of 1917-18. The protraction of the war for a further 2 years, its globalization, which Britain's intervention made inevitable. As Philip Zelikow showed in his recent book on the failure to make peace in 1916, Woodrow Wilson tried and failed to intervene and broker a peace in 1916. So I'm not the only counterfactualist here. The extension of the war for a further 2 years with escalating slaughter, the death toll rose because the industrial capacity of the armies grew greater. That's what condemns us to the Bolshevik Revolution. And it's what condemns us ultimately to Nazism, because it's out of the experience of defeat in 1918, as Hitler makes clear in Mein Kampf, that he becomes radicalized and enters the political realm. Take out those additional years of war and Hitler's just a failed artist. It's the end of the war that turns him into the demagogue. You asked what are the things that avoid the totalitarian states. As I've said, British non-intervention for me is the most plausible, and it takes out all of that malignant history that follows from the Bolshevik Revolution. It's very hard for me to see how Lenin gets anywhere if the war is over. That looks like the opportunity for the constitutional elements, the liberal elements in Russia. There are other moments at which you can imagine history taking a different path. If the provisional government in Russia had been more ruthless, it was very lenient towards the Bolsheviks, but if it had just rounded them up and shot the Bolshevik leadership, that would have certainly cut the Bolshevik Revolution off. One looks back on the conduct of the Russian liberals with the kind of despair at their failure to see the scale of the threat that they faced and the ruthlessness that the Bolshevik leadership would evince. There's a counterfactual in Germany, which is interesting. I think the Weimar Republic destroyed itself in two disastrous economic calamities, the inflation and then the deflation. It's difficult for me to imagine Hitler getting to be Reich Chancellor without those huge economic disasters. So another part of my early work explored alternative policy options that the German Republic, the Weimar Republic, might have pursued. There are other contingencies that spring to mind. In 1936 or 38, I think more plausibly 38, Britain should have gone to war. The great mistake was Munich. Hitler was in an extremely vulnerable position in 1938 because remember, he didn't have Russia squared away as he would in 1939. Chamberlain's mistake was to fold instead of going for war, as Churchill rightly saw, and there was a magical opportunity there that would have played into the hands of the German military opposition and conservatives to snuff Hitler out over Czechoslovakia. I could go on. The point is that history is not some inexorable narrative which can only end one way. it's a garden of forking paths. And at many, many junctions in the road, there were choices that could have averted the calamities of the mid-20th century.